Just outside the city of Rome, 444 years before the death of Caesar, a Roman man who has been exiled, cast out by his own people, has returned at the head of a foreign army. For the past 2 years, he and his men have ravaged the countryside, unable to be stopped. And now, he has returned home to the city that made him famous, and put it under siege. As he looks out across the fields towards the city, he sees something coming towards him he never would have imagined. Not soldiers, not envoys from the Senate with offers of peace. No, he saw the entire population of women of the city streaming towards him, led by his wife and mother. Hello there everyone, how's it going? I hope you're doing well. In this video, I'm going to go over the life and times of Gnaeus Marcius Coriolanus, who was a Roman general and war hero turned traitor that lived in the 5th century BC. Marcius was born into the old patrician Marci family. Sadly for him, he lost his father at a very young age and was brought up by his mother, but it's said that they were quite fond of each other, and from an early age, he was very fond of warlike feats. So as soon as he could, he began to handle different weapons, and he quickly proved to be the best of his generation amongst all the boys of Rome. His first military campaign came in the year 499 BC, when the last king of Rome, who had been overthrown, Lucius Tarquin Superbus, tried to take Rome back at the head of an army which was raised by his son-in-law, who was the dictator of Tusculum at the time. But this attack failed, and during the final battle, it's actually said that Marcius was fighting when he saw a Roman soldier go down near him. So he ran over, stood in front of the fallen man, and protected him by killing his assailant. And after the battle, Marcius received a garland of oak leaves from the commanding general in front of all the other men, which we know as the civic crown. It was given to a Roman soldier who had saved the life of another. Plutarch goes on to say that this wasn't enough for Marcius, though. In fact, over the years that passed, he's supposedly such a good soldier and performs so many acts of bravery that his commanders have trouble coming up with rewards and different, praises to give him, because he's just that good at being a soldier and fighting. But Marcius wasn't doing all this stuff for wealth and fame, apparently. What brought him the most pleasure was just the simple fact that his mom was still alive and able to hear about all the epic stuff he had done. He was so happy that he got to see his mom be told about how amazing her son was, and that she got to hear from basically everybody in Rome how lucky she was to have such an accomplished and admired son. The relationship he had with his mother was so close that he actually listened to her and married the woman that she told him to marry, and then even after he and his wife had kids, the family still didn't move out and they lived with his mother still. Now, pretty much at the height of his fame and popularity amongst the people, the first secession of the plebs takes place in the year 494. I've got a whole video on that if you're interested, but long story short, the plebeian population of Rome was going through some really, really tough times, and the Senate and patricians were doing nothing to alleviate the burdens faced by the poorer citizens of Rome. So finally, the patricians and Senate, they come together and say, you know what, we're going to help out the plebeians, but only if they joined the army to go and defeat a Sabine army that was threatening them. Well, the plebeians, they were like, okay, you're right, let's go beat up these guys first, and then when we get back, we can discuss coming up with something to help us out, maybe, get rid of some debts, stop imprisoning and beating people who can't pay. Well, immediately after the Romans win the war against the Sabines, the Senate does a complete 180 and ignores any of the promises that they made to the people before, and they go right back to arresting and imprisoning people who can't afford to pay their debts. Well, the plebeians, they had had enough. They all banded together and they left the city of Rome and camped out on the Sacred Mount. It's not really a mountain, but, it was a pretty big-ass hill not too far from the outskirts of the city of Rome. Now, the patricians were terrified that if they didn't come back to the city, they were completely open to attack. And of course, now that their personal property and lives were at stake, they decided it'd be a good idea to go talk to the plebs and see what they wanted. and maybe make some compromises with them, because without them, they wouldn't even have a population to rule over anyways. So, after some back and forths and capitulations by the patricians and the Senate, the plebeians, they agreed to come back to Rome and rejoin the army. This is actually where the tribunes of the plebs come from. This official government position will actually be the cause of a lot of trouble for the Republic, as well as being a position sought out by ambitious men who would use its power to further their own careers and wealth, rather than actually helping out the people. But, never mind that, let's get back to Marcius. Now, our man Marcius, he was not very happy with how everything went down. He was a patrician, so in his mind, he thought that these dirty plebs daring to go against the patricians was like treason, and he was very upset to see his fellow patricians cave into the demands of the plebs. A quote from Plutarch's Parallel Lives. As for Marcius, though he was displeased himself to have the people increase in power at the expense of the aristocracy, and though he saw that many of the other patricians were of the same mind, he nevertheless exhorted them not to fall behind the common people in contending for their country's welfare, but to show that they were superior to them in valor rather than in political power. That's pretty much saying, like, don't lower yourselves to their level. We shouldn't even have to prove or show that we have more political power than the plebs. We are just better than them. And that's it. So they should just listen to us. Now, while the first secession was going on, another Italian tribe of peoples, the Volsci, had been gathering an army and threatened to attack Rome as well. So as soon as the Romans got everything sorted out amongst themselves, they quickly levied another army and made their way into Volscian territory. This is after the first secession of the plebs. And it's against the Volscians where Marcius earns the name that he is mostly known by, and the name that I use for the title of this video, Coriolanus. It was in the year 493 BC, while serving in the army of the consul Postumus Cominius Aruncus, that Marcius found himself inside the military camp outside of the Volscian town of Corioli. The Volscians, they had been pushed back and trapped inside their city, but they were able to get a message out to another Volscian tribe, and their allies had answered the call, where a second Volscian army was headed towards the Romans that were encamped outside the city, just to see if they could probably, maybe provide some relief and end the siege of their countrymen. Well, the consul Postumus, he was no Julius Caesar, okay? He had no plans of building a wall around himself and trapping his forces in between two enemy armies. So, he took the majority of his forces to go and face off against the approaching Volscians, leaving a man named Titus Lartius in charge of a small force to keep an eye on the besieged Volscians. Well, the defenders sitting on the walls and inside the city, they saw Postumus leaving with his men and thought, you know what, this is a perfect time to go and attack the Romans outside their own walls. Because if we can break out of the city here, then the other army can go and meet and go to battle with the Roman force that is leaving, and if they can just hold them off for long enough, we can show up in the rear of the Romans, trap them, and destroy them. So, the Volscians got themselves ready and sallied out of the gate of Corioli, and very quickly were able to overcome the Roman soldiers who had been stationed there to hold them in. With the Volscians surging out of the city, the Romans began to fall back and then broke towards their camp, where Marcius was standing, watching his fellow soldiers be overtaken and run down by the Volscians. Well, Marcius, he wasn't having any of that, so he grabbed his spear and rushed out of the camp to confront the Volscians that were now chasing the fleeing Romans all the way back to the camp. It's also said that he had a small band of men follow him as well, and he and those men were able to hold back the Volscians and even kill some of the ones that ended up getting too eager and chased too far, causing the rest to flee. For he had, as Cato thought a soldier should have, not only a vigor of stroke, but a voice and look which made him a fearful man for a foe to encounter, and hard to withstand. Many of his men rallied to support him, and the enemy withdrew in terror. At this point, Marcius has stopped the assault on the camp and saved the lives of many other soldiers. But he wasn't done yet. No. The absolute mad lad that he was. He then started chasing the fleeing Volscians back towards the city, calling men to follow him as he began to charge towards the gates of Corioli, exclaiming that the goddess Fortuna had not opened the gates for the Volscians, but actually instead had opened the gates for them. And even as the men around him drew back and stopped their pursuit of the fleeing men, as they came closer to the walls and, arrows and javelins started flying at them, Marcius didn't stop. This crazy son of a bitch charged right on through the open gates of the town, even passing some Volscians as he did. At first, I think the Volscians, they were probably just confused, and they might not have even realized some Roman dude had followed them into their city, because Plutarch states that at first nobody would confront him, and everybody was kind of just like standing there for a second. But once the Volscians realized it was just Marcius and possibly, a few other men with him, they turned to face them and attacked the intruders in their town. Plutarch writes, enveloped thus by friends and foes alike, Marcius is said to have waged a combat in the city which, for prowess of arm, speed of foot, and daring of soul, passes all belief. He overwhelmed all whom he assailed, driving some to the remotest parts of the city, while others gave up the struggle and threw down their arms. Thus, he made it abundantly safe for Lartius to lead up the Romans who were outside. That is how he received the cognomen Coriolanus, by storming the town of Corioli by himself and winning the town for the Romans. Now, Marcius' story, it isn't done. It's not done yet. While all the guys who sat around and watched Marcius storm Corioli by himself, they looted the city, he actually made it pretty clear to them he thought they were kind of shameful, since their consul and the rest of the army was still out there somewhere, getting ready to, or already fighting, the other Volscian army that was sent to relieve the town. But most of them were like, yeah, whatever there, dude. Friggin' more loot for us. You want to go track down the consul, go ahead, be our guest. So he did. With just a few men that followed him, they made their way down the road that Postumus had taken earlier and came upon the rest of the Roman forces as they were preparing for battle. At first, the consul, when he saw Marcius coming towards him covered in blood, was like, what the fuck are you doing here? But when Marcius told him what had actually gone down back at Corioli, Postumus Cominius, the consul, embraced and kissed him. And with the news of the victory spreading through to all the other men, they began to cheer and yell at Postumus that now it's time for you to lead us into battle. Marcius, though, he just had one question. Marcius asked Cominius how the enemy were arrayed and where their best fighting men were placed. And when the consul told him that he thought the troops in the center were those of the Antiates, who were the most warlike of all and yielded to none in bravery, Marcius said, I ask and demand of you, then, post us opposite these men. So, the consul did. I shall read from Plutarch's Parallel Lives, describing the battle. As soon as spears began to fly, Marcius darted out before the line, and the Volscians who faced him could not withstand his charge, but where he fell upon their ranks they were speedily cut asunder. Those on either side, however, wheeled about and encompassed him with their weapons, so that the consul, fearing for his safety, sent to his aid the choicest men he had about his person. Then a fierce battle raged around Marcius, and many were slain in short space of time. But the Romans pressed hard upon their enemies and put them to rout. And as they set out in pursuit of them, they insisted that Marcius, who was weighed down with fatigue and wounds, should retire to the camp. He answered, however, that weariness was not for victors, and took off after the flying foe. The rest of the army, their army, also was defeated. Many were slain, and many taken captive. The next day, after the battle, Postumus, the consul, had his army gather around him so that he could firstly thank the gods for victory, obviously, but also so that he could reward Marcius and recount all the different epic shit he saw him do yesterday to everybody else. And when he was doing so, he told Marcius to take a full tenth of the loot that they had gained, as well as giving him a very nice horse. Sorry. Marcius, he did take the horse, but he refused to take more than what was owed to him as a soldier. He took his single share and then asked the consul if he could have one thing. It turns out he actually had a friend who was amongst the prisoners who had been taken, so he asked if he could free this man and save him from being sold into slavery. And Postumus agreed, and Marcius was able to save his friend from a lifetime of servitude. Now, with the Volscians dealt with for the time being, the Romans got back to bickering amongst each other. We're going to skip forward 2 years now after the Battle of Corioli. Rome found itself in the middle of a grain shortage, and the plebeians and their leadership, they were beginning to become more and more seditious. Well, luckily for the patricians, a town called Velitrae had been hit by some sort of sickness, some sort of plague, and the leaders of that city, they had come to Rome offering the Romans control over the city if they would just send some colonists to come and repopulate the place. But the tribunes, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Sicinius Velutus, well, they went around telling all the plebeians that this was actually not a good idea, saying to them that the patricians, they're just sending you to a city full of dead people and disease, and that they were really just trying to get rid of you plebeians. That's all this was. With their leaders telling them the patricians were up to no good, the plebeians refused to go to the new colony, but Marcius, who at this point was pretty much, he was the guy in Rome, everybody, he was loved by everybody, patricians and plebeians alike. So he took charge in speaking out against the tribunes and going against the demands of the plebeians. Remember, he wasn't very happy after the first secession of the plebs. So in the end, the colonists who had been chosen, they were forced to go to the new colony under the threat of very severe punishments. And since the plebs were refusing to join the military again, Marcius said, you know what, fine, I'll do it myself. And he gathered together his clients and anybody else that he could convince to join him, and he set out into the lands of Antium, where he returned from his campaign. He and his followers, they were actually being slowed down by the amount of corn, cattle, and captives that they were bringing back to the city. With his popularity at an all-time high now, Marcius decided that he would run for the consulship. And at first, pretty much everybody was like, yeah, this guy has done amazing things for Rome. It would be a shame, actually. Actually, we should be ashamed of ourselves if we didn't vote this man the consulship. But on the day of voting, Marcius apparently entered the forum very pompously. He was escorted by the Senate and surrounded by a bunch of patricians as well, and the plebeians, they didn't like the look of that at all. So they changed their minds, and they voted in some other guys into the consulship for that year. And of course, that pissed off Marcius. In his head, he was like, excuse me, after all I've done for you people, and the city of Rome, you're going to deny me the consulship? How dare you? I mean, he was bitter as hell towards his fellow Romans, especially the plebeians. Now, while all this was happening, a large shipment of grain, remember they're in a grain shortage here, a large shipment of grain arrives in Rome from the lands of Italy, but a larger portion of it came from Sicily. The tyrant there named Gello, he had sent it as a gift, kind of, a gift of grain to the Romans. So he was probably, a pretty decent guy. And with all this grain in the city, people thought, great, now the market price on grain is going to go down, it's going to stabilize for a while, and they actually thought that the grain that was given to the city by Gello would be distributed out to the most in need as a gift, since, it came to the city as a gift. Well, the Senate was convened, and while they were inside debating, people began to gather around outside the Senate House in anticipation for the announcement of what was to be done with the grain. Now, some of the senators there probably did think the grain should be given out as a gift, or at the very least, the price drastically dropped. But our man Marcius, he wasn't having any of that. Marcius rose in his place and vehemently attacked those who favored the multitude, calling them demagogues and betrayers of the aristocracy, declaring that they were nourishing to their own harm the evil seeds of boldness and insolence which had been sown among the rabble. These they should have choked when they first sprang up, and not have strengthened the people by such a powerful magistracy as the tribunate. Marcius also says that by giving in to the plebeian demands and allowing the tribunes of the plebs to be created, it weakened them even more, and that they weren't one people, but two peoples now, that were unable to ever grow beside each other because they'd always be at odds with each other. He said they should actually take away the tribune of the plebs and go back to the old days when the patricians were in charge, and that if the plebs wanted grain, then they would have to agree with that. Now, his message actually did resonate with a lot of the older and wealthier senators, as well as many of the younger men in the Senate. But there were some who went against Marcius because they knew what he was saying was not going to lead to anything good. In fact, actually, the tribunes of the plebs had been present, and they had heard everything Marcius said. And when they saw that many other senators were going to agree with him, they ran out of the Senate House and announced to the people that were gathered outside there what Marcius's plans were for them. Very quickly, a large crowd of angry plebeians gathered, and apparently they even tried to get into the Senate House, or they were going to try to get in, when, to calm the situation down, the tribunes brought forth a formal denunciation against Marcius and ordered him to appear before them in the assembly. But Marcius, he just laughed at that. He was like, yeah, right. And he sent the messengers that they had sent to him back to the tribunes. Well, the tribunes said, fine, we'll come do it ourselves. We'll come get you ourselves. And we're going to bring the plebeian aediles with us as too. But when they tried to take Marcius by force and they actually laid their hands on him, the other senators and patricians, they all banded together and fought back, and they were able to drive off the tribunes, and it said they actually beat the aediles up, so it sucks for those guys. At this point, evening has fallen over the city of Rome, and it's caused, the turmoil of the day to die down a little bit. All of the previous events that I just talked about there, they all happened within like the span of a few hours. But when the sun rose the next day, the forum, it was already filling with people, and the consuls saw this, and they were worried about the outcome of another day like yesterday. So they convened the Senate, and they made speeches imploring them to come to their senses and to begin to make some reasonable solutions and real proposals to the plebs. Now it's not the time to be fighting amongst each other. And surprisingly, the senators, well, most of them, agreed. And while the senators convened about what to do, the consuls left the Senate House, and they went outside to speak with the people gathered there. And when the tribunes of the plebs saw how the consuls were acting and hearing that the Senate was, they were with the consuls and what they were saying, they too said, we are willing and wanting to work together, except for that one dude. That one guy who was talking all that shit yesterday. Marcius. Yeah, no, we want his ass to be punished immediately. We want him to come to court and answer against these charges. Could he deny that he had instigated the Senate to violate the Constitution and abrogate the powers of the people? Secondly, when summoned to appear before them, had he not refused? And finally, by insulting and beating the aediles in the forum, had he not done all in his power to incite the citizens to arms and bring about a civil war? Well, turns out Marcius shows up out of nowhere, unexpectedly, and he goes right to the plebs and right to the tribunes, and he's like, dude, you know what? No, fuck you. I'm dope as hell. Everything I've ever done or said is correct, And the fact that you plebeians can even bring a man like me of patrician status to trial is a disgrace, and you guys suck. You made Rome suck, and I hate you. You can only imagine the hatred and vitriol that must have been spewing towards him during his speech about how the plebs ruined Rome. And, as you can imagine, this bold move didn't pay off for Marcius because Sicinius, the tribune of the plebs, immediately sentenced Marcius to death, and that he should be brought up to the Tarpeian Rock and thrown off for everybody to see. They ordered the aediles to go forth and seize him, but again, when they tried to put their hands on him, the other patricians that were there, they rushed forward and pushed them back, protecting Marcius. And after a brief scuffle, Sicinius, he realized that there would be no execution of Marcius today, unless he ordered the plebeians around to go and attack all of the other patricians defending him. So he relented. But he told the men guarding Marcius that fine, you can take him now, but he will be brought to trial, and the court date was set for the third market day. The patricians, they were hoping that since the court date was decently far off, that the people's angers, they would subside, and possibly they would even forget about the whole thing by then. But the time and the date, they came around, and no, the plebs, well, more specifically just the tribunes, they didn't forget. And the Senate, they were still kind of split. Some of them thought this was absolutely appalling, that they were going to let the plebs actually try in court a patrician. The ones who were okay with it thought, the plebs, they wouldn't dare to actually punish him too harshly. One of their own, like one patrician. They thought, what's the worst that could actually happen? When the trial began, Sicinius, he focused on the speech that Marcius had given, the one where he said that they should take away the tribunes and that the plebs should have never been given equal power as the patricians. And out of nowhere, he threw in how he handled the loot that he gathered from Antium. They said that when he came back, he didn't put any of the spoils of war that was won into the public treasury, but instead, he had doled out payments and spoils to the men who had gone on campaign with him. Marcius was not ready for that accusation. More not ready for that truth to be brought up, because he did give out the loot to the people who came with him into Antium. So all he did to combat that was kind of just start praising the people who had joined him, I guess trying to get the crowd on his side, but it was of no use, because most of the men gathered there had not been with him, so they quickly shut that down, and in the end, they voted against Marcius. But it wasn't for death. They voted to banish him from the city of Rome. All the other patricians were distraught. They couldn't believe that the highest amongst them had just been punished by mere plebeians. Marcius, though, was cool. It said he didn't look like it even affected him. He left with his head held high and made his way home, where his mother and wife were waiting for him and begging him not to leave. But he just gathered a few things and made his way to the city gate with about 3 or 4 clients to accompany him. Marcius then spent the next week out in the countryside going over his options and trying not to let his anger make his next judgments, because he hadn't really shown the Romans how he felt, but he was absolutely filled with resentment and hatred towards his fellow Romans, who he had done so much for in his eyes. So he came to the conclusion that he would go to one of the other peoples that have been fighting against Rome and join them, and he chose none other than the Volscians. Now, there probably wasn't a more hated Roman amongst the Volscians than the dude who embarrassed them by taking one of their cities all by himself. But Marcius knew the king of the Volscians somewhat personally. Tullus Aufidius, the king, and Marcius in their younger years had been in many of the same battles together, and had said that they often hurled insults and challenges at each other from across the field. So we can assume, like Marcius did, that he didn't really like him. But Marcius also knew that as king, he really, really wanted to retaliate against the Romans. So Marcius made his decision. He would go to Tullus, The only problem was that he couldn't just go walk up to his city like he was just like some guy. No, if Volscian people saw him, they'd jump his ass like he was a crip in a Bloods neighborhood. So he disguised himself and waited till evening to make his way into the city and to the house of Tullus, where he managed to get inside without alerting anyone, and then just sat down by the home's hearth and waited in silence. When somebody finally realized what was going on, they rushed to get Tullus, who was eating his dinner, and when Tullus entered the room, he asked the stranger who he was. Marcius stood and removed the cloak covering his head, and was like, "Sallied, it's me. Now I know you probably aren't happy to see me, but hear me out. Those bitch-ass Romans, they freaking exiled me because they were jealous of how awesome and cool I am, so now I'm pissed. I didn't come here to try and harm you, and I definitely didn't come here to die. I came here because I know that you, just as much as me, want to teach the Romans a lesson and get some revenge for the things that they have done to us." Now, his speech to Tullus was much more eloquent than my version, but you get the point. Tullus, surprised as he was at this turn of events, was nonetheless happy to have one of the former leading Romans join him against the Romans themselves. He invited Marcius to dinner, and then they spent the next few days going over the war to come. Now, since the last war between the Volscians and Romans, a peace treaty had been put in place, and the Romans also didn't really take the Volsci as much of a threat anymore. They were so complacent with the Volsci that when the great games were held in Rome that year, young Volscian men were allowed to attend and to enter the games. The great games, they were an annual festival held in Rome each year where multiple different religious ceremonies were held, and also some games of athleticism and stuff. Well, during the festivities, Marcius and Tullus, they were able to get agents into the city of Rome, and they began to spread rumors that during the games, the Volsci were going to attack. And when the rumors made their way to the two consuls of Rome, they decided that they would just have to kick the Volscians out of Rome, and they would not allow them to partake in the ceremonies or in the games. And this, of course, upset the various Volsci that were there in Rome, but they couldn't do anything about it, and they were forced to leave the city. And now, with tensions already running high, Tullus, he stepped in and he began to fan the flames. He started riling up his people, reminding them of the land and the towns that they had lost in the last war to the Romans, until eventually he got them so mad that they decided that they had had enough of these Romans, and they were going to take their stuff back. Tullus also told his people he had the perfect man to bring the war to the Romans. Not wanting to waste any time, Marcius told the Volscian leaders that he wanted to take anybody who was actually ready to go fight right now and go raid into Roman territory while the rest of the army was being mustered. He wanted to hit fast before the Romans even knew what was happening, and he had a strategy. He was going to go attack all of the plebeian-held lands and all their farms, while leaving any patrician-held land alone, and he was hoping that by doing this, he would drive an even bigger wedge between the patricians and the plebs, making it even easier to destroy them both. And he was quite successful in his little lightning raid campaign. It said that he gathered so much loot, the Volscians, they didn't even know what to do with it all. And while he was off raiding, the Volscian army had been assembled and was ready to take the field. And when Marcius returned, Tullus, the king of the Volscians, gave him command of the field army, while he remained back in his own territory with a smaller defense force, and off Marcius went to destroy the Romans. The first town he came to was a colony of Rome, Circe, if that's how you pronounce it. These people were smart, and they submitted to Marcius without a fight, so he allowed them to keep their goods in gold and let the city be. He then made his way into the land of the Latins, where he assumed he would find the Romans waiting for him there, because he had heard of all the different messengers that the Latins had sent to the Romans, asking for help since they were allied to each other. But the two consuls of that year, they didn't come to the aid of the Latins because their terms were almost up, and they didn't want to possibly end their term in office with a loss to Marcius. Now, this was perfectly okay with Marcius. He assaulted and took the towns of Tolerum, Lavicum, Pedum, and Bola. These cities' inhabitants were either put to the sword or sold into slavery, but for the towns that didn't resist him, he let them off without plundering their goods or taking any slaves. Now, that last town that he subdued, Bola, that was only a little bit over 12 miles from the city of Rome, and in this town, it said that he put almost all of the adults to the sword. So it seems the closer and closer he's getting to Rome, the more and more personal these sieges are becoming, and more of the people within these cities seem to be on his bad side, rather than the first couple towns he took where it doesn't seem that he faced much resistance. Now, back in Rome, people are freaking out. But still, the plebeians were refusing to join the army, and the patricians were unwilling to come to terms with the plebeian leadership. That is, until the news that Marcius had besieged the city of Lavinium. Now, this city was very important to the early Romans because they believed it was the first city that Aeneas had founded when he landed in Italy after the Trojan War, hundreds and hundreds of years before. And the Romans also stored their sacred symbols of their gods in Lavinium at this time. So it was a very, very important place to them. So the plebeians, they changed their tune and actually went to the patricians and said, look, we want to rescind the charges that we laid upon Marcius and allow him to return to Rome, and hopefully when he hears this, he'll stop attacking us. But the patricians, for some reason, they said no. Now, in the beginning, there was plenty of patricians who had stood by Marcius and thought what the plebs had done to him was terrible and unjust. But now, with the plebs wanting to forgive Marcius and allow him to return, the patricians are standing there saying, nope, not going to allow it. Either because the patricians didn't want Marcius to think that it was the plebs who had allowed him to return, or because they were now actually against Marcius for turning against Rome and helping the Volscians. It's not exactly clear why they denied the request of the plebs, but when Marcius found out that the plebeians had brought the motion to absolve him of his charges to the Senate, and that the Senate had denied the motions, he stopped his siege of Lavinium and headed straight towards Rome. Marcius brought his Volscian forces all the way up to the Fosse Cluiliae, the Clulian Trench, which was only 5 miles from the city of Rome. This trench had supposedly been built by the Alban king Gnaeus Clulius during the war between Rome and Alba Longa. It's so close to Rome that you could probably see the Volscian army if there were any buildings or if the walls of Rome were higher than the trees surrounding the city. This, of course, scared the crap out of the Romans, and very quickly the Senate decided that they were going to send ambassadors to Marcius. They decided to send a man who was a relative of Marcius to the Volscian camp, but when he was brought to Marcius, he did not get the answer he was hoping for. When he asked if he would please stop his attack against his countrymen, Marcius was angry and bitter towards his fellow Romans. He demanded that the Volscian territory that was taken in the last war was given back to them, and that a decree should be made giving the Volscians the same type of civic rights with the Romans that the Latins had been given, and that there would be no stopping of the war until those demands were met. And with that, he gave them 30 days to make up their minds, and then he packed up his army and left to go plunder more Roman allies. The Volscians, they weren't too happy with his decision to withdraw. In fact, Tullus, who at this time, he's been overshadowed by Marcius to the point that nobody listens to him really, and the soldiers, they only really listen to and want to be commanded by Marcius. Well, this made Tullus jealous, and he tried to say that Marcius withdrawing was a betrayal to them, and that they had lost a golden opportunity to have revenge against the Romans. But Marcius, he paid no mind to those accusations, and he continued to raid the Roman allies. and he also took several more of their towns, all while the Romans made no attempt to help their Italian allies. When the 30 days were up, Marcius brought his force back to the Clulian Trench, where again he was met with another Roman embassy. And this time they told Marcius that if he were just to take the Volscian army out of Roman territory and disband them, that the Senate of Rome would be much more willing to talk peace terms, even if it included giving back the lands of the Volsci. But the Romans, they would make no concessions out of fear. Marcius replied, as the general of the Volsci, he couldn't agree to those terms, not even close. And that as a still citizen of Rome, he would advise them to think very carefully about what they really wanted to get out of this peace deal, because they might just lose everything. He then gave them 3 days to give him an answer, and that they shouldn't return again unless that answer was capitulation, as his camp would be much too dangerous for them to come through again. Well, when the Senate learned of this, the only thing they could think to do was to order all of the various religious officials within the city to put on their religious regalia and go to Marcius and ask again if he would please cease this war against his home. But Marcius again denied their request and sent the leading religious officials of the city back to Rome. And when they returned, it was decided that all they could do was wait quietly in the city and to man the walls in case of an attack. In Plutarch's writing, he goes on to explain how, whether it be due to the gods putting thoughts and feelings into our heads, or maybe it was just done by a person's own volition, but that sometimes a feeling comes over some people to take action, to make a move, and to not just sit there and wait to see what fate has in store for them, but to get up and make their own. It was at this time in the city of Rome, a woman named Valeria got the idea in her head that she and the other women of Rome would go to the house of Volumnia, who was the mother of Marcius, and ask her for her help in getting her son to stop his war against Rome. So they went to Volumnia, and also to Marcius's wife Virgilia, who was with Volumnia at the time, and pleaded with her to go to her son and see if she could get him to change his mind about attacking Rome. She said that she didn't even think her son cared for her anymore, since he had taken up arms against his own city, and she knew that before he had held Rome above all, even her. But in the end, the women were able to convince her to come with them, and she agreed to accompany the rest of the women to the Volscian camp. When they arrived at the camp of the Volscians, the sad state of affairs that they were in caused even the Volscians to remain quiet and respectful towards the women. Marcius, who was with his council, was made aware of the women, and when he saw who was leading the procession, he couldn't help himself. He jumped up from his seat and ran towards his mother and wife, who had brought his children with them as well. It said that he didn't hold any emotion back, and that he let his tears flow as he held them in his arms for as long as the moment allowed. Then, when he was ready, and he saw that his mother had come to say something to him, he stepped back with the men of the Volsci and let his mother say what she had come to tell him. Plutarch says her words were the following: "Thou seest, my son, even if we do not speak ourselves and can't judge from the wretchedness of our garb and aspect, to what a pitiful state thy banishment has reduced us. And now be sure that we who come to thee are all of women most unhappy, since fortune has made the sight which should have been most sweet, most dreadful for us, as I behold my son, and this wife of thine her husband, encamped against the walls of our native city. And that which for the rest is an assuagement of all misfortune and misery, namely prayer to the gods, has become for us most impracticable. For we cannot ask from the gods both victory for our country and at the same time safety for thee. but that which any one of our foes might implicate upon us as a curse, this must be the burden of our prayers. For thy wife and children must needs be deprived either of their country or of thee. As for me, I will not wait to have the war decide this issue for me while I live, but unless I can persuade thee to substitute friendship and concord for dissension and hostility, and so to become a benefactor of both parties rather than a destroyer of one of them, then consider and be well assured that thou canst not assail thy country without first treading under foot the corpse of her who bore thee. For it does not behoove me to await that day on which I shall behold my son either led in triumph by his fellow citizens or triumphing over his country. If, then, I asked you to save your country by ruining the Volscians, the question before thee would be a grievous one, my son, and hard to decide. Since it is neither honorable for a man to destroy his fellow citizens, nor just for him to betray those who have put their trust in him. But as it is, we ask only a relief from evils, something which would be salutary for both parties alike, but more conducive to fame and honor for the Volscians, because their superiority in arms will give them the appearance of bestowing the greatest of blessings, namely peace and friendship, although they get these no less themselves. If these blessings are realized, it will be chiefly due to thee, and if they are not, then thou alone will bear the blame for both nations. And though the issues of war are obscure, this is manifest, that if victorious, thou will only be thy country's destroying demon, and if defeated, the world will think that to satisfy thy wrath, thou did bring down the greatest calamities upon men who were thy benefactors and friends. Marcius stood there in silence for a long, long moment. Then his mother began again, pleading with him and questioning him until she finally threw herself down at his feet in anguish. At this, Marcius cried out, "What hast thou done to me, my mother?" He then picked her up and took her by the hands, and for a time he and his mother and wife spoke privately, and when they were done, he sent them back to Rome, and then took his army away from the city. Now the Volscians, they were like, "Hey, what the fuck, man? Like, really sweet and emotional, like, great stuff, but, like, we came here for a reason." But Marcius, I guess, because they respected him so much, nobody wanted to go against his orders. Nobody went against his orders, and the Volscians agreed to end the siege. Of course, many of them were not happy with Marcius at all, but it said many of them weren't really, or couldn't really be mad at him or blame him because of what had happened, and they understood the emotional toll the meeting with his mother must have taken. The Romans, though, they were happy as hell. They threw open their temples, started partying in the streets. It was a great time for them. The women, who had saved the city from destruction, were told that they could have anything they wanted, but they decided all they would like is that a new temple dedicated to the goddess Fortuna was built in the name of the women inside the city, which they would also pitch in for themselves. They just wanted the public to take care of all the different sacrifices that were to be done at the temple, sorry. As for Marcius, or Coriolanus, if you'd like to call him, well, he made his way back to Antium, the lands of the Volsci, where Tullus, who by now really didn't like Marcius for stealing all his thunder, began to plot against him. Tullus was still the chief of the Volsci, so he ordered Marcius to disband his army, and also that Marcius needed to come and give a full accounting of his time in charge. See if he was skimming some off the top or not while he was in charge of the Volscian forces. Well, Marcius said, "No problem, I'll give up command. I mean, the only reason why I have it is because you guys wanted me to be in charge, so no big deal. And sure, I'll come give you guys a rundown of my time in charge, and we can go over all the books and shit. Not a problem for me." When the assembly was called to determine the fate of Marcius, at first Tullus and his supporters they tried to stir up resentment in the Volscian crowd against Marcius, but when Marcius himself rose to speak, the crowd grew silent, and as they listened to him recount the deeds he had performed for them, even bringing up that, like, yes, I did withdraw from Rome when we had the city beat, but the only reason why you were even there in the first place was because of me, okay? So relax, like, don't come at me with that. Well, Tullus could see that Marcius and his speech, they were beginning to win the crowd over, and he and his conspirators, they were having none of that. Tullus ordered one of his men to attack Marcius, and while crying out that the Volscians shouldn't listen to this treacherous Roman, and that he was going to try and become their tyrant, he lunged at Marcius and began to cut at him with his sword. Marcius, who was unarmed, had no chance. It said that not a single person stepped forward to try and protect Marcius, and he died where he fell. The Volscians, they took his body, and they actually gave him an honorable burial and decorated his tomb with many different gifts, as if he was one of their own chiefs. But when the Romans heard of his death, they gave it no attention at all. They didn't honor him or try to vilify him at all. The women of his household, they were allowed to mourn for the customary 10 months, and that was it. The wars between the Volsci and the Romans are far from over, but with the loss of Marcius, the Volsci, they didn't really stand a chance against the Romans, and they will eventually end up being conquered by the year 300 BC. And that is all she wrote about Gnaeus Marcius Coriolanus, the Roman hero turned traitor. But before I go, I'd like to just do a little modern take on the events, like I kind of did with the Catiline conspiracy. I came to the conclusion that I thought that Caesar was probably behind Catiline, and he just wanted to see how far Catiline could take his coup. I think he might have just used it as a sort of a trial run when he would eventually try and take control of the Roman state. In this instance here, I think it could be possible that the later Romans came up with this story of Marcius as a way of kind of being like, yeah, they didn't beat us. The Volsci, I mean. Actually, it was a Roman guy who was leading them, and that's the only reason why they were so good. And, once he left, we were able to beat them again, and, it was super easy. Probably trying to save face, or make up an excuse for this time period where they were losing against the Volsci and in danger of actually being overrun by them. But, either way, true or not, it's a good story, and I hope you enjoyed listening. And I also hope you have a good one.